I appreciate everybody coming out. This is the last week of the George Washington leadership lessons, and what we've been able to do these last couple of weeks is just really go through and look at some of the different examples of leadership that Washington had, and some of the things that the authors were showcasing for us. You know, one of the things that I liked about this book in particular were the chapters were short and sweet, to the point, and it gave you some really good examples without needing to dive into a lot more detail than what we wanted to digest. One of the things too with this that I wanted just to cover with people is I really appreciate everybody taking approximately 4 hours out of their busy schedules and allowing me to talk about these leadership ideas, allowing us all to explore them. And as a thank you to everybody, I want to offer a free 1-hour consultation to the group. And my contact information has been on the emails that have been going out to the group, as well as the website. And so I just want to put that out there. Whether you want to just talk over going through a mock interview, whether you want to talk over some ideas that you have for your business, whatever it might be, please feel free to reach out to me, and we'll set up this 1-hour consultation and just discuss what's going on in your life and your business life and how I can help you out. There's a couple of things that I offer, a couple of services, and one is personal coaching. And the personal coaching that I offer is working through some of the challenges you might be facing as somebody that's starting down their career path. It could also be challenges that you have where you have some decisions to make. You might have been promoted recently into a position of authority, a position of leadership, and need to explore and talk with somebody about some ideas on how you set up the tone for your team. How do you start to set expectations? How do you start to manage the message that you want, both for your team as well as for the externals resources that you come in contact with? Now, one part of this as well that I work with people on is just getting life back on track. Work with a number of individuals where we've just been able to sit down, come up with some action plans for some goals, near-term goals, anything a year or less, and just map out some of the milestones that they need to have in their life to get back and start hitting some of these the goals that they have and moving forward in their personal life. With business coaching, I typically will work with younger businesses that are about 1 to 3 years in age, ones that have started to grow and started to move past the initial startup phase of working everything out on a card table in somebody's dining room. And with that, I typically will work with entrepreneurs and business leaders with defining where they are in their business. Where do they best fit in what they're trying to accomplish? We also work at gaining clarity on how to launch and keep growing
I think your mic might be muted.
Is this better?
Yeah, there we go. It cut out about a minute and a half ago.
Hey, yeah, it's good to hear you again.
Very sorry. I didn't even see that I had a mute on my mic. I'm not sure what happened there, so I do apologize with that. We just started back into chapter 12, the leader does R&D, and we were talking a little bit about the importance that leaders understand the concepts and the technology, especially that affects their organization. This day and age, in all the ready to have research that you can do, you can go to Google, you can go to YouTube, you can go to so many different places now to find out what you need to know. But at a high level, leaders need to know the concepts and how that technology all fits together, how those processes fit, and they have to know that so that they can understand when their direct reports are presenting potential projects, are presenting strategic ideas to them, that they're not just simply taking somebody's word for it, but they actually understand what's being pitched to them. Sometimes I think, and I've come across myself, where as people get promoted up through an organization, they stop the learning. They stop going in and reading even trade journals and keeping up on their field. And I think that really is a shortfall in their leadership, and it hurts the organization as a whole because they're just reliant upon their direct reports. And although hopefully they've hired the best people they can, sometimes the leader needs to make a decision that goes against some of the recommendations just because they have a different view of the organization and a different understanding of the strategic ideas where the organization needs to go. So without having that R&D, without having that background, a leader can handicap themselves. A leader works to find ways to increase the outputs and improve the processes, and this really goes hand in hand with the first bullet point. Every leader is going to try to streamline their organization. They're going to try to do something better, and part of that's going to be to put out better products. It's going to be to put out better services. But you're also looking to how you're going to be able to reduce your labor and reduce some of the capital costs. And, an organization that I've worked with, UPS, is a master at industrial engineering. I mean, they can squeeze out pennies in cost savings by doing some of the simplest things that we now think of. One of the prime examples with this is the idea of trying to reduce left turns with the vehicles. If you can keep vehicles moving, you reduce stalls, you reduce gas consumption, you reduce all these things. And it seems like such a slap in the forehead. Why didn't we think of this type of idea? But it's that reduction in labor, that reduction in capital that allows them to take millions of dollars in cost savings and then pour it into other activities. And so leaders really do look to try to increase their output and save their expenses. Let's go to the next one. Now, how did Washington demonstrate research and development? I think one of the biggest points in this book that came out was the idea of all of the farming enhancements that Washington had. When you go through this book, it talks about he would sit there and study that in order to plant a field, you first have to break it up and you have to do the plowing. And then you come behind and plant the seeds. And Washington worked for a couple of years on developing a device that would do both, that would break up the earth, create the rows and furrows that they needed, and then also be able to plant the seeds or drop the seeds as needed. And so he did that. And, think of the time saving it is just to have to walk through a field and break it up once and not have to go back again. You can take that labor and you can put it to other projects that you have. another one, if you're ever in luck and are able to go see Mount Vernon, is this basically, I believe it's an 18-sided shed. And so Washington, saw how to break up the wheat, you'd put the cut wheat out on the ground, and you'd run horses or mules over top of this wheat and break it up and break the kernels away from the chaff. And then you'd have to come back by and pick all that up, separate all that material out from each other, and then take your wheat over to the granary and to the mill to have it processed. You could only do this, of course, if you had dry weather conditions. You could only do this if the ground had been, is firm enough. So even if it's dry, if the ground's still wet, then you can't do this processing. So he developed this barn that essentially was 2 levels, and you had these very narrow slats in the wood, and you could walk the horses around and around and around and keep putting out wheat. They would separate it out, and the grains would all fall down below where it's covered. So even if it's raining outside, the grain's still protected. You could still process, and you could still keep the operations moving. One of the important ones in terms of R&D that Washington had was an early adoption in inoculation. When most of the armies up through probably, this is just my guess as a novice historian here, up through probably World War I, most of the deaths that occurred in armies was due to disease and infections. A lot of times it was dysentery, flu, some of these other things that would come through. And it would sometimes kill a third to half, in some cases, of the armies that are out there in the field. And Washington saw that they were having a start of having smallpox hitting the colonial army. And as a reaction to that, what he did was he instructed the surgeons to go ahead and start the process of inoculation. If you watch some of the bonus videos that I put on the website and shared last week, you'll see that it was not the nicest way of getting inoculated, but it was very effective because he was able to take his army, essentially make them sick, and then have them well enough to take to the field the following campaign season. So during the wintertime when they were away, they could go ahead and get sick. They weren't engaged in active combat with the British, and then they were able to proceed early on. But without that inoculation, he would have lost a number of men and resources with the army. Now, what, as leaders, what are we doing? And this can be rhetorical, or somebody can answer, but what are you doing on, let's say, a monthly basis or a weekly basis to keep increasing your learning and development? And what are some of the ideas that you have, or tips and tricks that you're using as people that, probably if you're like me, you could use 28 hours in a day instead of the 24. But think about ways that we have today that we didn't have 10, 15, 20 years ago. We have podcasts now. We have, on-demand learning through, even YouTube and some of the other channels that are out there for us. And so pretty much anytime you have spare time, you could be learning something. And so I think as leaders, it's up to us to not only look at, in my case, kayaking videos and weather reports, but also putting time aside to watch, some old, Earl Nightingale videos, or watch something that's going to keep feeding me and keep my R&D going. As we move forward, the leader values presentation. And a leader really understands the value of business acumen, manners, dress, and vocabulary. And one of the questions that I have here that I'd love some feedback, but if, it may just be something for us to think about. Have you ever seen a presentation or a sales pitch that just really, the material was great, everything is going great, but maybe the person presenting just really, I hate to say blew it, but maybe they just came up short because their presentation skills weren't there. Maybe their manners, their dress, their vocabulary. Maybe some of these intangibles just weren't there and it turned off their audience. Has anybody ever experienced that or seen that happen in their business or professional life? I know sometimes when we're presenting, a lot of times people are looking at the message as well as hearing the message. And what I mean by that is that when somebody's put together properly, when somebody's looking their best, when somebody's dressed, to fit the situation, that's as much a part of that message as anything that you have on a sell sheet, anything that you have on a PowerPoint. And a leader understands that role of perception as reality. You could come in and have dirty boots and ripped up jeans, and you might be one of the best talking, best salesperson out there. But if you're not put together right, the perception is that you don't know what you're doing, or the perception is that you're really not the person to be selling a high ticket item dressed the way you are. And this is something that I struggle with sometimes, because this goes back to maybe my teenage years where, just judge somebody on who they are and what they are and what the content is. Don't judge based on the looks. Don't judge based on how you're hearing the message. But the older I get, the more experienced I get, I understand that perception as reality. And that's such an important part that, people start to accept. And one of the examples that really struck home with me is one of the times where I moved from the East Coast to the West Coast is going to some wedding receptions on the West Coast, where being an East Coast person, I've got a jacket on, I've got a tie on, slacks, the whole bit. And I'm there, and I'm actually the one that's overdressed. Everybody else, including very significant leaders in the area, very significant people in industry, on the West Coast, they got away with cargo shorts, Birkenstock slippers, and a polo shirt. And it just blew me away that if you took that same group of people and dropped them onto the East Coast, how offended the family might be of people showing up to a wedding reception dressed like that. And, so there is a little bit of knowing who your audience is and knowing what the expectation is and what the reality is going to be for that group. One of the other things that stuck out with me is I've had friends that have gone through the University of Virginia or UVA MBA program. And I remember them talking to me about how one of the electives for that MBA program is all about business acumen and manners. And part of this was going through and learning what wines go with what dinner, learning how to order wine at a business dinner, learning how to conduct themselves during a sales presentation, during business meetings, and then as well as the after meetings when you're having dinner with everybody. What kind of restaurants to be looking for when you're taking people of a certain business stature out. It's not just finish the sales call, finish the sales meeting, and we're all running to Denny's for the Grand Slam breakfast at 6 p.m. But it's knowing where to go and what to do so that you can continue to close that deal, so you can continue to work on the sales pitch and really value that presentation that you have. Now, one of the ways that Washington valued presentation was that early on, I believe the book calls out in 16, 17 years old, he paid for dance lessons. And, the way I take some of this is not only was it a social grace to be able to know how to dance well, But I think as Washington learned that he needed to build a network, even though he came from a comfortable background, if he was going to elevate himself in social standings, he needed to build that network. And an important part of building that network is also to win over the wives, the girlfriends, the nieces, the daughters, the female companions of the males that he was trying to interact with. They would hold a lot of value and a lot of sway in making sure that he was invited to the next party. And so by learning how to become a good dancer, that's one of the best ways that he could interact one-on-one with some of the female hostesses that he had, as well as his female guests. And as we learned in this book, as Washington grew older, his dance card was constantly filled throughout the night, to where he would be up on his feet 2 or 3 hours doing dance lessons. And all that, I believe, led to the growth of his network and led to the growth of selling his ideas to the people within that network. The rules of civility. In the second section of this book, there's the copy of the rules of civility. And the focus is really on the social graces, not so much the morality, not so much the do's and don'ts of a young gentleman, but really the social graces so that they could learn to present himself well. And the right clothes for the right occasion. I think where it's called out a couple of times where Washington was very careful with how his clothes were tailored, how they were made to fit, and what the impact was, especially on the clothes that he chose. When he went to the Continental Congress, he was the only one that showed up in a military uniform. And, you know, it made it very clear that he was open to having, you know, maybe he wasn't looking to be the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, but certainly wanted a high position for that. And by being the one person that showed up wearing essentially a general's uniform, it set him apart and it set the expectation, and it turned everybody's eye towards Washington as a military leader. And then it made sense to go ahead and issue him a command.
Greg, I'd like to comment on that.
Sure.
Especially some of the comments you made in the past. I feel like I can't keep quiet just because of the line of work that I'm in. But when we dress appropriately for the occasion, we are, and if we don't ever have to apologize for being overdressed, but we do have to apologize for being underdressed. So in the case where George Washington came to this in full garb, he was showing respect for the occasion, respect for the people around him. So, and that's what I tell my young clients who are just entering the workforce, and they're saying, you know, hey, I'm educated, I have something to offer. It doesn't matter how I look. When you go into the interview, and then when you're first starting out, you dress to show respect for the company that you represent and for the people that you represent too. It doesn't mean that it's cramping your style. Sometimes I call it big boy clothes. So right. in this case, George Washington was right on the mark. Yeah,
absolutely. And, you know, the thing is too, is that it shows respect for the office, and it shows respect for those that you're dealing with. You know, I don't think that you can ever underestimate what that does for the people that you're reporting to when you show up and you're properly dressed and groomed for the situation.
That's true. And, you know, there are people who can say, well, Steve Jobs, he didn't even wear shoes. And, you know, look how successful he was. I mean, the guy had hygiene issues. But for 98% of the rest of us, we need to play by the rules and dress appropriately. And that means dressing as a leader. You know, when I give wardrobe consulting advice, it's different for every part of the nation, just like you said. In the East Coast, my advice is different than my West Coast people. And you're right on where you said, know your audience. And that's the truth. But like I said, you don't have to apologize for being overdressed. It's when you have to apologize for being underdressed that you have a problem.
Yeah, it's easy to take off a jacket and unbutton a collar than it is to show up and you're wearing some ratty jeans and some old shoes and trying to blend in and hide with a group that is better dressed than you are.
That's correct.
So thanks for that.
Mm-hmm.
And the last part of this is the presentation that Washington had was really also setting a tone of conduct when dealing with other armies and other nations. The book really does a good job of pointing out about how when the colonial army and the French army defeated the British finally and defeated Cornwallis, how Cornwallis didn't come out to surrender. He sent one of his junior generals to go surrender. And Washington could have taken that, could have taken the general's sword, gone on with the surrender ceremonies. But I think he had a presence of mind that knowing that if he did that, he would be signaling to the world, and especially the British, that the colonies and his role as commander-in-chief was less than the commander of the British forces. And we also see this too with how he reacted and how he entertained other nations when they started to send envoys over to the U.S. and when he started sending his ambassadors overseas, and he gave very clear direction on how they were supposed to conduct themselves and how they were supposed to act. And just as a follow-on to this, once we moved past the revolution, France and England were at war, and France was demanding that the United States send troops, send supplies, and get involved in start another war with the British ourselves. And Washington kept us out of that. And he, worked with France as an equal and not as somebody that we owed, meaning that we were subservient to. And that really also, I think, helped set the conduct and presentation of how the United States would in the future work with other powers and other military situations. Chapter 14, leader sets high standards and exceeds expectations. And the way that I think the leaders exceed expectations is that they set the high standards for their teams. They set high standards for themselves, and they expect that their teams live up to those high standards. I think that we can see in several instances in business life, in sports, in many different areas, where when people have average expectations, they'll always rise to those. The team will never, and the organization will never rise higher than what the leader expects. And as a leader, you're always trying to look for how you can move up, how you can set higher standards, how you can push your team to exceed. And in service industries, I think it's very easy to exceed expectations. And the reason I say that is because over the last, let's say, 20 or 30 years, how often when we have work done on a vehicle or work done on our homes or work done, period, after the contractors leave, after the people finish with what they're doing, are we walking around and finding trash, finding nails, finding different things that were wrong or missed? And it's because I think that a lot of the service industries are focused on how fast can I do the job and not meeting or exceeding customer expectations, the leading part of their business. And think about examples of how you had your socks absolutely knocked off when you went to a service center and they just went ahead and washed your car. Even if they just took it through the basic car wash setting, you went in, you had some tires rotated, you had something done, but they went ahead and washed the car anyway. They went ahead and vacuumed it out for you, and then when you got it, it was cleaner than it was when you dropped it off. or when a company finishes work on your home and they walk around and you can't find those loose nails that have fallen off the side of the house and into your flower beds. You can't find those scrap pieces of wood because the leader of that crew came around and made sure that everything was picked up. And exceeding expectations can be the lifeblood of any kind of a service industry. It's easy to be in the middle. It's hard to be at the front end of that. But think about the referrals. Think about the customer satisfaction that you get. And then as leaders, think about the impression we make on those that we report to and those that report to us. If we're meeting and exceeding the expectations that we have. And when I mean that a leader under promises and over delivers, it's not so much that you want to talk about doing less. It's that you want to over deliver to the point where you're always seeming to go that extra mile. You're giving a service, and then when they come and take delivery of something, they get an A+ experience. It's looking for that wow factor in some of the work that we do and some of the ways that we work with our teams and some of the standards that we set. Again, to me, it's easy to be in the middle of the pack. It's harder to be out in front and exceed those expectations. But when you do, boy, as a customer, you just feel excited to go and share that word about how your experience was. So now, how did Washington exceed expectations as a leader? He took over command, and the first bullet point goes back to the French and Indian War, but he took over command from General Braddock and led an organized retreat. So Washington, again, you have to put yourself back in that time and back in that mindset a little bit to understand how significant this was. Washington's probably 22, 23 years old. He has been made a colonel in the militia. Braddock and the Virginia forces have been sent over into the Cumberland to go push the British out, and they're fighting in the woods. The general gets shot, and chaos starts to break down. Communication starts to break down, and Washington rallies the British forces and doesn't lead them to a victory, but instead saves them from an ultimate defeat and from being captured by leading an organized retreat back. And it would have been very ordinary, let's say, to have the officers and have the army captured by the French after the general was shot, having the entire campaign end in failure because that one leader fell and nobody was there to pick up the pieces and lead the people out. So it was very exceptional that happened. And Washington expanded Mount Vernon to 7,000 plus acres in a number of different states. Washington was born very comfortable. He inherited Mount Vernon from his older brother, and it would have been easy for him to have held to a status quo. Keep Mount Vernon a small working farm, to just take care of what he had. But instead, Washington expanded his holdings. He expanded his businesses, and he really grew Mount Vernon and his estates. And then 8 years as commander of the Colonial Army and 2 terms as president. And he resigned each time, which was remarkable. I think in some of the quotes that we read in the book, even King George III was talking about if Washington actually resigned from the head of the army and didn't make himself king or didn't make himself ruler, that he was the greatest person in that generation. And Washington didn't just do it once. He essentially did it twice. He could have kept being president until the day he died, but he had served his 8 years each time. 8 years just happened to be as long as the Revolution and his term as head of the army was. But each time he resigned and went back home and left public life. And this last chapter, chapter 15, a leader has heartfelt faith. You know, to me, one of the things that stuck out in this chapter was going through this with having a tolerance for different religious beliefs. It wasn't, at this time in American history, you didn't have as many different faiths that were on the shores of the United States at this time. But it was important to have tolerance. Different colonies were set up with different religious institutions as the institution of that colony. And we had Protestants, you had Quakers, you had Catholics, you had many different splinter groups, but understand I'm Baptist. You have different Catholic offshoots that were part of this. And Washington and a number of the leaders understood that they had to be tolerant of the different religious practices. And one of the things that was a founding principle of the United States was this idea of the separation of church and state. And it wasn't to take church out, it was just to make it so that people could practice their individual faiths. And as a leader, I think that it becomes our duty to encourage those that work for us, that are in our teams, to have the freedom to practice and observe their faiths. Of course, there's balancing acts as far as time off, certain rights and certain things that go on that may not be appropriate in the workplace, but you want to be as tolerant as possible. You want to give people as much space as possible to really practice or not practice their faiths. One of the things that I really enjoyed when I was at a Boy Scout camp and working at a scout camp was having a number of different people of different faiths. And we would always try to encourage them to go out and attend their services. And of course, some young men away from home don't always go do that. And then others were very faithful to that. And I remember going to Jewish services with members of my team and going to Protestant and Catholic services and being there to show that I was supporting their faith and their observance of their faith. And, I never really got much more out of it than that, but I always felt that it was a good shot in the arm and a good way to show that I supported my team. Now, how did Washington show heartfelt faith? He publicly and privately gave credit to God, Providence, Supreme Ruler. There's a lot of discussion about exactly how religious he was. And I don't know that. I've never really studied how deeply religious Washington was. But it seems to me that he, in private letters, in public documents, especially in his different speeches, that he always gave, credit to, again, God, Providence, Supreme Ruler. And he always gave the proper due, so that even if he wasn't the most religious person, in the world, so to speak, that the people that did understood that he did believe in a higher power, a power that was guiding him and guiding the young country and guiding what the actions were. And Washington was a strong supporter of religious freedom, and I've talked about that already a little bit. But one of the quotes that I liked out of this book was talking about that for happily the government of the United States gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance. And this is definitely more of an ideal than a practice that the government has been involved in. But that's okay to me, because the ideal is there and the goal is there. And sometimes the government and sometimes people stumble along the ways. But if this is what we're driving for, then I support that. Does anybody have any thoughts on this particular chapter? This one was interesting to me. again, and especially when it comes time to help support those of faith that are in your organization or in your network.
I had a thought about that, just kind of thinking about supporting faith and belief. I think it's important to those on your team, supporting their goals, their ambitions, kind of the things that they hold personal and dear, that would be like faith, that would be like religion and belief. Because it gives you more of a sense. I've noticed doing the same thing, working at a Boy Scout camp and a couple other experiences. The team works together in a completely different way once you start knowing, what others are working towards, when they know what you're working towards, when they know what you hold personally important.
Mm-hmm.
And I think too, just kind of thinking, it can stretch beyond just faith and just religion, but those are really, faith and religion are really your core beliefs, your core, what you stand for. And it's comforting to kind of put that out there and get support back from it.
All right, thank you. And I think too on that is that even if you as a leader don't have, let's say, faith from a religious standpoint, that you honor those that work with you and honor those that are on your team by giving them the space and giving them the support to practice and encourage that behavior. I mean, I don't know much negative behavior or much negativity that comes out of allowing somebody to practice their religion and practice their faith, and accept that faith in religion is interwoven within their life and within even their professional life. So it's a good comments there.
Greg, I have something I'd like to comment on as well, too.
Sure.
I feel that if you are in a leadership position or even in a work situation, if you proclaim to be a religious person, that you're really setting yourself up to always have the highest level of integrity. I had a boss years ago who claimed to be born-again Christian, and he was one of the foulest people I've ever been around. And he would put it in people's faces, and his business practices were abysmal. He sexually harassed the employees. He was a bully, and it just really turned me off that he was also touting trying to be so high and mighty with his religious beliefs. Now, and I'm a very religious person myself, but I think if you're going to talk about it in the workplace, then you really have to remember just to keep the highest level of integrity if you're going to use it in the workplace.
Sure, and thank you for that. And one part of that too is that it's, we're not talking necessarily about proselytizing. We're not necessarily talking about trying to push religion on anybody, but giving people the space and people the ability to have that in their life. Thank you. So this was the last chapter, and a couple of things just to review again is think about what struck a chord with you during this 4 weeks. As we started out, I talked about that we weren't looking for people to go from, let's say, a 2 to a 10 on the leadership scale, but maybe move from a 7 to an 8, or an 8 to a 9, or a 9 to a 10. And so hopefully there's been a few lessons, a few examples that have stuck with you where you can start to incorporate those into your life, into your professional life, and move that ball forward. And where do you see these lessons in practice? I know one individual I talked to was actually filled out a reference, kind of an attaboy card type of thing at their work, where I'm poor English on this webinar tonight, folks. I'm sorry for that. But he had seen his manager put into practice a couple of these items that we had talked about and actually wrote an attaboy for his manager. So I'm hoping that you start to become aware of where you're seeing some of these leadership examples in your personal and professional life, and that you can start to comment on them. Maybe give somebody an attaboy. Maybe talk to them about what they're doing. And even if you reference it back to George Washington, I mean, think about how, ecstatic somebody would be if it's like, oh yeah, you're doing something exactly like George Washington did back in 1778. And then think about too, what areas do you think you can improve on still? And where do you think you can still go from this? And maybe this is where we go back into that, leaders, self-taught. A leader is always looking to grow their education. A leader is always looking to do the R&D. So if there's gaps, if there's areas in your own life, maybe one of the things you can do is search out materials that can help you fill some of those gaps and move some of those areas a little bit forward in your own leadership progress. And again, I just want to say thank you to everybody who have been calling in, who have been participating in the webinar. I really appreciate all the support. I really appreciate the feedback that I've been getting. If there's anything that I can do for you guys, please reach out to me through email or give me a call. And especially, once again, I want to just throw out there, everybody has definitely a free 1-hour consultation. If, again, you want to work through some kind of a mock interview situation, I'd be more than happy to take you through that. If you want to talk about something that is, a stumbling block at work that you need to work on, I'd be happy to give you some input and ideas. And if you have something with your business that you want to talk about, how you can grow your business, how you can create a teamwork atmosphere that's really going to elevate the morale of the team, and how it's going to really move things forward, feel free to reach out to me anytime. I'm here to help you, and I'd really love to pay back all the respect and all the support that everybody's given me. So this is it. This is the 4th week. And again, just a huge thank you. And if there's anything I can do, of course, call, shoot me an email, and let's connect and help out. But thank you, everybody. And I hope you all have a very good evening.
Thanks, Greg. That was great.
Thanks, Greg.
Thank you.